This is a lecture on axial skeletal muscles. Okay, so this lecture is based on Martini's chapter 9, 10, and 12. Here are the learning objectives. There are two drawing assignments. Both of them are about the muscles that move the rib cage and are involved in respiration. These are among the most important axial skeletal muscles because they are involved with us breathing, and of course, that is a vital function. However, there are many axial skeletal muscles. Here is the list that you are going to learn. All right, we will start with learning about the origins, insertions, and actions of muscles, and then using origins and insertions to predict the actions of a muscle. All right, so most skeletal muscles are attached to the skeleton on either side of a joint where two or more bones meet. Skeletal muscles may also be attached to connective tissue or skin. Origins and insertions are the points or places where the muscles attach to the bone, connective tissue, or skin. Okay, so origins and insertions are the points of attachment. The origin of a muscle is the point that remains stationary during a movement. The insertion of a muscle is the point that moves during a movement. How is it decided whether the point is remaining stationary or is the one that is moving? Well, normal movements in the anatomical position are looked at, and it is decided by that examination whether the point of attachment is either the origin that is remaining stationary or the insertion that is moving. Normal movements are used rather than unusual movements that the body makes sometimes. Another way to determine the origin and insertion is to designate the proximal attachment as the origin and the distal attachment as the insertion. Okay, actions. Most muscles change the position of one or more bones. They can be said to have an action on the joint or an action on the bone that they are effecting. Martini's recommends describing the actions of muscles by the joint that they are effecting. Therefore, for the bicep brachii, the action that it makes is flexion of the elbow joint. However, Martini's often describes the action of muscles in the most understandable way. So, the action of the supinator muscle, which supinates the wrist and hand, and the action of supination, can be described as lateral rotation of the radius. The action of the pronator teres and pronator quadratus muscles can be described as medial rotation of the radius. Notice we're describing the bone's movement, not the action of the supinator muscle and the pronator teres and pronator quadratus muscle on a joint, but rather on a bone. So different language is sometimes used, just roll with it. Okay, the origins and insertions of muscles can be used to predict the action of the muscle. The structure of a joint also helps to explain the action of a muscle, but let's think about the origins and the insertions. For example, the masseter muscle originates on the zygomatic and temporal bones, okay, and inserts on the ramus of the mandible. And you can look over at this picture. The masseter muscle is in green. The origin is the point of attachment that will stay stationary. And the insertion is the point of attachment that will move. We learned that muscles can only shorten when they contract. Therefore, it can be predicted that the masseter muscle elevates the mandible because we know the origin, we know the insertion, we know that the muscle has to shorten. Therefore, it must be that the masseter muscle elevates the mandible. Okay. Now, of interest, superficial muscles are usually relatively large. They cover deeper, smaller muscles. The deeper muscles cannot be seen unless the overlying muscles are reflected, which means cut and pulled out of the way. Many figures in martinis have superficial muscles reflected to show deep muscles. In fact, they often have pictures in which half of the picture on the left side, let's say, is showing superficial muscles, and the other half of the picture is showing deep muscles with the overlying muscles reflected out of the way. There are also figures in martinis that show bones marked with origin points of muscles in red and the insertion points of muscles in blue. And this just helps you to visualize not just the parts of the bones that you can see attached to the muscles, but sort of get underneath the muscles and see, are the origin and insertion points small? Are they broad on the muscle? What exactly is going on there? Then there are tables of muscles in martinis that list the origin, insertion, action, and innervation of each muscle. We actually will not discuss the innervation of each muscle, so you don't have to pay attention to that part of the table. And the tables are quite large and encyclopedic, but they're very helpful. If you just forget the origin, insertion, and action of a muscle, you can quickly look through the tables in martinis and they will have your answer for you. Martinis is a good anatomy text. The roles of muscles. Roles of muscles are not actions of muscles. This does not refer to what movement the muscle makes, but rather the role of the muscle in the movement that is occurring at the joint. So we'll use a lot of examples and make this clear. Take a moment just to put in your mind that the roles of muscles are not the actions of muscles. And pay attention to this little 7-slide section and figure out for yourself what the role of a muscle is. I'm saying this because I have found that students tend to forget that the idea of roles even exists. When I ask them about it, they tend to mistake roles for actions of muscles. Okay, so let's begin. So when a skeletal muscle contracts, it may have one of 4 roles. It may be the agonist, the antagonist, the synergist, or the fixator. The role of a specific muscle can be different in different movements. A muscle whose contraction is mostly responsible for producing the movement is acting as an agonist or prime mover. It's the star of the show. For example, when the bicep brachii contracts, flexing the elbow joint, it is acting as an agonist. A muscle whose action opposes that of the agonist is acting as an antagonist. For example, if the agonist produces flexion, the antagonist produces extension. When an agonist acts to produce a particular movement, the antagonist has to stretch them in a lot of movements, but it does not relax completely. Instead, the action of the agonist is adjusted by the antagonist controlling the speed and smoothness of the movement. For example, when the bicep brachii flexes the elbow joint, it is acting as an agonist in the movement. The tricep brachii on the posterior of the humerus contracts slightly to oppose and stabilize the flexion of the elbow joint. The tricep brachii is acting as the antagonist in the movement. A muscle whose contraction assists that of the agonist is acting as a synergist. Synergy means working together. Synergists stabilize the origin or add pull near the insertion. Synergists are often most useful at the start of a movement when the agonist is stretched and relatively weak. Their importance in assisting a movement decreases as the movement progresses. When the bicep brachii flexes the elbow, it is acting as the agonist in the movement, and the brachioradialis and the brachialis, 2 other muscles that are attached to the humerus and to the radius help the bicep brachii flex the elbow joint. They are both acting as synergists in the movement. And finally, agonists and antagonists that contract at the same time are acting as fixators. Fixators stabilize a joint to create a fixed base for the movement of other muscles. This is a separate example from the bicep brachii performing elbow flexion. So I will give another example here that is different. The wrist flexors and wrist extensors, which control the movement of the wrist, can contract at the same time to stabilize the wrist joint. This gives the hands and the fingers a fixed base from which to contract and to perform fine movements. So I'm sure you can think of plenty of examples in which you keep your wrists stable and move your fingers, perhaps typing on a keyboard, holding your phone and using your thumb to quickly text. All of that would be examples of the wrist extensor and flexors stabilizing the wrist joint so that the fingers could do their work. So just to review, now that I've explained, there are 4 different roles that a muscle can perform. It can be the agonist or prime mover in a movement. It can be the antagonist in the movement. It can be the synergist in the movement, or a fixator in a movement. Now, muscles are often arranged in fascicles or bundles of muscle fibers that are organized so that the muscle lies in a certain direction. So I will now move on to fascicle arrangements. So muscle fascicles or bundles of muscle fibers can have different arrangements that are associated with the action of the muscle. Most muscle fibers contract at the same rate and to the same degree, interestingly. However, the organization of muscle fascicles influences the action of the muscle. It can make the muscle have more strength or less strength in and of itself just because of the arrangement of the fascicles. Muscle fascicles have 4 general arrangements: parallel, convergent, pennate, and circular or sphincter. Of these 4, I will give examples. And just be aware that parallel arrangements are the most common, and sphincter arrangements are extremely important clinically. So parallel muscles have fascicles that are arranged parallel to the long axis of the muscle. Most of the muscles in the body are parallel muscles. The bicep brachii and the rectus abdominis can be used as examples of parallel muscles, but there are many. In convergent muscles, the fascicles are spread out like a fan with the tendon at the tip. A convergent muscle can change the direction it pulls by contracting only one group of the muscle fibers that it includes at a time. Generally, when a convergent muscle contracts using all of the muscle fibers, it does not pull as hard as a parallel muscle of the same size because all of the fibers are not pulling in the same direction at once. The pectoralis major is a convergent muscle. In pennate muscles, the fascicles are attached obliquely or at a slant to the tendon. The tendon runs the length of the muscle. A pennate muscle has more muscle fibers than a parallel muscle of the same size. Therefore, it produces more force than a parallel muscle. The rectus femoris of the thigh is a pennate muscle. That's the anterior-most muscle of the thigh that extends the knee joint. And you could see why it's important that it be an extremely strong muscle. So the fascicles are really packed in there in the pennate arrangement. In circular or sphincter muscles, the fascicles are arranged in a circle around an opening. They close off the entrances and the exits of tracts in the body. The orbicularis oris is around the mouth, closing off the mouth. When contracted, a circular muscle makes the entrance or the exit smaller, and when it's relaxed, it makes it larger. There are sphincters found throughout the body. There is one around the mouth. There is one around the opening from which urine comes, the urethral sphincter. There is one around the anus called the anal sphincter, and there are others. The names of muscles may come from different characteristics. Perhaps the position of the body, such as anterior, the region of the body, such as abdominis, the structure of the muscle, biceps, which means two, bi, and seps, which means head, the action of the muscle, for example, flexion, so the muscle's called a flexor, or a muscle may be named for its attachment points. The sternocleidomastoid muscle attaches to the sternum, the clavicle, and the mastoid process of the temporal bone. So to review, there are 4 general arrangements of fascicles, and the arrangement influences the strength of the muscle. They are all important, but the parallel arrangement is the most common, and the circular or sphincter arrangement is extremely important clinically. Definitely want a person's sphincters to be working properly. Certainly, if a person has an injury, for example, in childbirth, in which during delivery their anal sphincter is damaged, it's very important that the sphincter be repaired correctly, or the person may have problems with the function of their anal sphincter, which could very much influence their quality of life. All right.